Michael, I've thought of reality as consisting of four categories: material things, abstract things, consciousness, and a spiritual world, God, if that exists. Four categories. But when you think about it, there are also relationships among these categories. Is causation, for example, is that a real thing that exists?
Well, let's start with different relations. I mean, relations that people view as relatively uncontroversial are spatial relations, for example. I'm a certain distance from you. Temporal relations, one event occurs before another, etc. And the vast majority of philosophers are quite happy with spatial relations and temporal relations. But I think there are also good reasons for bringing in other relations that can't be reduced to spatial and temporal relations. And causation is the key category.
Now, to most people, causation is very simple. I push something, it moves. What could get simpler than that? It sounds trivial.
Okay, but the question is, what sort of account you give of two events being causally related? And you can see the difficulty if you consider a world that's not our world, but a world where Newton was right, and it's a world of Newtonian physics. In a world of Newtonian physics, if you know where all the particles are right now, you can use the laws of Newtonian physics to predict where they'll be at any future time. But you can also use the laws to predict where they were at any earlier time, right?
Right.
And so there's a certain relationship between how things are now and how they are in the future, how things are now and how they are in the past. Causation corresponds to the one direction from the present to the future, but doesn't correspond to the direction from the present to the past.
But it did from the past to the
That's right, yes. Okay, so you have causation going in one direction, right?
Yes.
But if you think about the patterns that there are in the world in terms of the spatial temporal relations, you can have a world where it looks the same in both directions. Here's the simplest case. Imagine a simple world where you have two particles rotating endlessly about one another. It looks the same in one direction as in the other, right? So spatial and temporal relations don't tell you, so to speak, in what direction things are going, right? The relation of causation, on the other hand, would be something that gave you a direction to the process.
So you're saying that causation imposes an arrow, a directionality to time or to effects in the world?
Yes, precisely. Now, there are other accounts that people give of the direction of time. Physicists give an account in terms of the expansion of the universe and so on, right? But if you think about certain cases, I think you can convince yourself that causation is really the key, right? And so one case that's useful to think about is the case of time travel, okay, right? And so you get into a time machine and you travel back 100 years in the past. Right?
Kill your grandmother.
That's right, yes. Okay. But you don't do it instantaneously. It takes a while, okay, right? And so, maybe you're clean shaven when you set out and you have, a bit of growth of beard by the end, or maybe you had too much to drink because you're afraid of what might happen in the time machine and so on. So you were thoroughly inebriated when you got on it, right? But you sobered up by the time you got back 100 years, okay, right? And so the idea is that inside the time machine, causal processes are taking place. And so to speak, they're going from later times in the external world, that's world outside the time machine, to earlier times, right? And so it looks like there's, so to speak, a personal direction of time in the time machine, which is the opposite of the direction of time in the outside world, right? And if you ask yourself, what's the basis of that? It's very plausible to think that, it's causation within the time machine, right? So to speak, that provides the direction of personal time within the time machine. So I think there are good reasons for thinking that the basis of the direction of time is the direction of causation. That's the fundamental thing.
But the example that you gave is a purely hypothetical one. That may not be possible at all.
Well, but though it's hypothetical, it shows something about our concept of time, right? And so, it's natural to think, that it took, Doctor Who or whatever, 5 hours to travel back 100 years, right? And that 5 hours is based upon how clocks are performing,
inside the
time machine itself, right? And so it looks like, that there is a conceptual connection between the direction of time and the direction of causation. And though it's only a possible case, that's all you need really to have good evidence for a conceptual connection.
Would that mean that the concept of causation is more fundamental than the sense of time?
Well, I think the sense of time is based upon causal relations. I think, for example, that memory is quite crucial. I think that if you had no memory at all, including no short-term memory, right, I think you'd have no sense of direction of time. So I think that what happens is that, I snap my finger, right, And at a certain time, I perceiving a certain event or, being directly aware of a certain thought, and that's connected with a memory of my snapping my finger the earlier time, right? And so I think that short-term memory plays a crucial part in giving us a sense of the passage of time, right? And so it's not that causation is more fundamental, but it's that causation is actually part of the process and the crucial part of what gives us a sense of the direction of time.
Is there anything about causation that is different than our common perceptions? That people talk about backward causation. Is that at all possible?
Well, that's a very difficult issue, the issue of backward causation. Some philosophers think they can disprove the existence of backward causation. Other philosophers embrace it enthusiastically and use it to explain exciting things, including things in physics, like EPR experiments. But I myself inclined to think that backwards causation is probably not logically possible, but it's extremely difficult to disprove it. Disproofs typically consider looping cases, the case where you go back in the past and you kill grandfather before he's reproduced, and so your father was not produced and you weren't produced, and so you drop out of existence. And
so you couldn't have killed your grandfather.
That's right. So you get in loops where things, switch back and forth. Okay, right. And so those loops are definitely problematic. Okay, right. But you can't disprove backwards causation by focusing upon causal loops, because there could be oppositely directed causal processes that, so to speak, didn't intersect one another. Okay. It could be, for example, that when you die, contrary to what I think, you have an immaterial soul, right? An immaterial soul then travels back in time, but you can't affect anything. You can't kill a granddad or, have granddad meet grandmother and so on, right? All you do is just observe events earlier and earlier in human history, right? And so in that situation, no contradictions are going to arise. And so you have to show that's impossible if you're going to show that backward causation is impossible.
How about the workings of causation between these four categories that I said? Material objects, I think we all would recognize, have causal relations. But how about abstract objects, consciousness, and a potential spiritual world or God? How does causation work either within those categories or between those categories?
Well, I think it works fine between most of them. I think the exception is abstract objects, okay, right? And I think it's really puzzling how things that don't have temporal location, okay, can enter into causal connections. And if you think, for example, the direction of time is based upon the direction of causation, then wherever you have two things that are causally connected, you're going to have a temporal relation, okay? The connection isn't so much just between the object, it's really between an object at a time, okay, and another object at another time, or objects interacting.
So you have no problem, theoretically, in a possible world where there is a God who has a causal relationship with the material world, or a world in which consciousness is fundamental and independent of the physical world, having a causal relationship with the physical world. You may or may not think that those things really exist, but you have no causal philosophical problem with them.
No, I don't think some people have felt, and some people feel today, that there's some problem about causal connections between things that are very different, like, an immaterial mind, for example, and a body, or between, immaterial deity and the physical world. But though I disagree with Hume on causation in many regards, I agree with Hume's view that anything can cause anything, okay, leaving aside abstract objects, okay, right? And so I think as long as you have something that, so to speak, can have temporal location, it can be causally related to other things, okay? That means, of course, that if you think of causal relations between God and the world, right, then on my view, God had better be in time. Now, some theologians reject that view, but I don't see any strong reason to do so, right? And so as long as you're prepared to put God and his mental states in time, right, I see no reason why he can't be causally related to the physical world.
Where you have the problem is abstract objects.
Yes, I think so, because I say that, the problem is that abstract objects, if they exist, always exist and so on, right? And so
the nature of red, a mathematical 1 and 1 equals 2.
Right, okay.
These.
So suppose I, acquire a concept that I've never had before, okay? And the question is, how is that related to the abstract object? The abstract object always existed, okay, right? How is it that caused me to have that concept at one time rather than at any other time and so on. So I think that there is a problem about causation involving abstract objects. And my preference would be to try and, so to speak, analyze abstract objects away in some other way. For example, in the case of numbers and mathematical objects, I like the idea of explaining mathematics in terms of statements about possibilities and giving an account of possibilities that doesn't involve any abstract objects.
But in all cases, when we're dealing with categories of things that really exist, material objects, abstract objects, consciousness, and a potential spirit world, that the nature of causation actually becomes a very interesting probe of the nature of each of these categories.
Yes, that seems right. And I mean, it's a reason for, treating abstract objects is really quite different than concrete objects, including immaterial beings and so on. And I also think that the fundamental concept of causation is the same in all those cases. I don't think it depends upon the sorts of things that are related. I think you have a single uniform concept of causation that can be applied to relationships between all those different categories of concrete objects.
And I find it fascinating that although you do not believe in a deity in a spiritual world or the independent nature of consciousness, you're more than happy to admit that if there is a causal relationship possible, that you are more than happy to admit that a causal relationship is possible between a possible God or a possible independent consciousness and the physical world. You have no problem with that.
No, not only do I have no problem, but in the case of consciousness, I think that there are causal relations. That is, I think that the sorts of experiences that you and I have do bear upon the physical world. They cause us to describe them one way rather than another way. And some philosophers reject that idea. They think that there are conscious experiences and so on, but they think that the only thing that does the causing is, so to speak, electrons, protons, neutrons swimming around the brain, neurons firing, and so on. That strikes me as not a very plausible position because, if these, so to speak, experiences we have don't have any causal oomph, then the conclusion would be that even if, a deity with a sense of humor had created a different world where there were no experiences at all, these conversations that we're now having would still be going on as if we were having experiences.